Introducing Skeptic's new edition. Our minds colliding with AI precision. We've got the answers to your burning questions. Unlocking the secrets, decoding the missions. Created by AI, this jingle is divine. Catchy and vibrant, it'll blow your mind. Artificial intelligence, a topic so new. Explore the depths of what it can do. Get your copy now, it's ready to unfold. Order online, shop, Skeptic, come behold.
Hi everyone, it's Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about our sponsor of this episode. It's Brilliant. Brilliant is an app you just download on your phone, tap it, open it up, and you can take different kinds of courses, tutorials, lessons, and so forth. It's an online learning platform. It allows you to learn about pretty much anything and everything of importance in science, in technology. And guess what? They have a course on how LLMs work. You know what LLMs are, large language models. ChatGPT. How does this work anyway? I have no clue. So I start the lesson. I just tap Start Lesson. It opens right up to me, for me, and allows me to do 7 different lessons on how it works, including typing right in there and hitting Submit to see what ChatGPT produces for me. Anyway, that's the kind of thing you could do if you want to learn how LLMs work in 7 easy lessons that takes all of like 10 minutes. I love teaching myself. I'm an autodidact by reading and learning online different new topics. Check it out, Brilliant. They're a great company, brilliant.org. And if you go to brilliant.org/skeptic, you get a free 30-day trial and get 20% off your annual subscription. All right, check it out. Thanks for listening. Here's our podcast. All right, my guest today is Maxwell L. Stearns, who is the Venable Bajer and Howard Professor of Law at the University of Maryland, Carey School of Law. He's authored dozens of articles and several books on the Constitution, the Supreme Court, and the economic analysis of law. His new book is, here it is, I have it on PDF form. You can see it there. It's called Parliamentary America, the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy. Max, thanks for coming on the show to talk to me.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I can show you what the actual book looks like.
Yeah, please. Good.
So your readers will be able to
Yeah.
will be able to see it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I didn't get my physical copy in the mail. It'll probably come as soon as we're done here.
We'll work on that. I'll get that fixed.
No, it's all good. I read it in PDF form, so it's what good timing. I mean, everybody is talking about, of course, the 2024 election. Everybody's worried between Trump and Biden. Neither one of us would be most people's preferred candidate. But what are the alternatives? And there's quite a few books about a broken democracy or the end of democracy around the world and so on. So let's just start there. What's the problem that needs to be solved?
The problem that needs to be solved is our system of creating the government, our system of two-party presidentialism. And we've put up with it for a really long time. We've put up with it for going on quarter of a millennium. But in the information age, it has encountered fundamental problems that have created the risk of autocracy or collapse that have confronted other democracies as well. And I decided to write this book because it occurred to me that people weren't properly diagnosing the problem. They saw symptoms of democratic failure. People were beginning to propose any number of solutions, including term limits and ranked choice voting and at-large multi-member districts, bypassing the Electoral College in various ways for the national popular vote. And I looked at all these and realized that they either would not solve the constitutional crisis that we're facing, they could not be enacted, or both. And I realized that there was a way out of the crisis and that it required us to really rethink the way we do democracy. And so that's the mission of the book, is to educate people in a way that hopefully is accessible and even fun, by taking folks on a virtual world tour across 7 countries to show how other democracies work and how we can make the best features of better systems our own and emerge a thriving multi-party democracy.
Yeah, just pulling something off the headlines I see this morning. Elise Stefanik has said that she would not have done what Mike Pence did, namely count the Electoral College votes. I don't know if she really believes that or if she's just trying out for VP for Trump and wants to say whatever he wants to hear. But
Very
that would
possibly.
be an example of constitutional law requires you do X. And if somebody refuses, had Mike Pence refused to do it, that would have been a kind of crisis you're talking about.
Well, I mean, I actually think we're in the midst of a constitutional crisis. I think a lot of people imagine that a constitutional crisis emerges in some kind of a spectacular fashion, like an event.
Yeah.
And I think that's a mistake. I think that the Ziblatt-Levitsky book, How Democracies Die, nicely explains that actually the demise of democracies historically across the globe has resulted from the steady degradation of longstanding democratic norms. And it can last for decades. It can take a very long time. It's not an event, it is a process. And we are in that process. I think we are in the crisis. It's not as if we're waiting for the crisis. We're in the crisis. When the inflection point will be at which we will inevitably be forced to institute some fundamental change, that's hard to predict. But there's no doubt in my mind that we are at the level of dysfunction that corresponds to a democratic crisis, that we are living it. And we've been living it for some time. It's not something that's immediate. This is something that we've been living with for, easily going on a decade at this point.
So something like the events of January 6th, that's not the crisis. That's the result of this crisis you're talking about.
I think that's right. In other words, that could have been an inflection point if Mike Pence had heeded what Donald Trump wanted him to do. That may have triggered the inflection point, or it could have actually collapsed our democracy. But I don't think that the way to describe it is that event was the crisis. I think you've got it exactly right. That event was symptomatic of a longer standing crisis our nation is facing. And one of the main points that I wrote the book was to explain that this very much has to do with institutional features that provide the foundation for our failing democracy. And we have to confront that reality. We have to get past the idea that we have the perfect system, this notion of American exceptionalism, that somehow a group of people meeting in Philadelphia a quarter of a millennium ago forever came up with a solution as to how to do democracy, and that we have nothing to learn since then. I think that's profoundly mistaken, and we have to get past that and be willing to open our eyes and learn from the experiences of other nations around the globe that have either succeeded or failed in facing down their own threats to democracy.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the founders. I've read the Federalist Papers and all those documents, surrounding it, and it is impressive what they were able to do. But they're not gods. They didn't presciently see Twitter on the rise and social media as a divisive force. So how could they? Nobody could. So the approach you take that I like is what's called the comparative method. We can't run controlled, gold standard controlled experiments where we have one country try one thing and another country try another thing and see what the results are. But that does happen anyway, naturally. So let's look around and see what has actually happened and then compare, which is what you've done here. But before we get into that, that's the second part of your book. Just give us a basic civics lessons for those of us who forget since high school, how the government's supposed to work, the checks and balances, what the founders intended when they set it up like that, and why it turned out a little bit differently than maybe their intentions.
So the way that I like to explain it to my own students is the framers imagined that they created something we might think of as a rock, paper, scissors constitution. So the idea is that the president can veto legislation that comes from Congress. So the president beats Congress. The Supreme Court can strike down laws that the president likes or executive orders that the president issues if they violate the Constitution. So the Supreme Court beats the president beats Congress. So you think that the Supreme Court will therefore beat Congress. But of course, Congress can overturn statutory rulings with ordinary legislation. It can institute amending processes to overturn constitutional rulings. And so we have this kind of loop, right, where the Supreme Court beats the president beats Congress, Congress beats the Supreme Court. But then there's another layer, which we can call the scissors, paper, rock constitution. Congress can override a presidential veto. The Supreme Court can strike down laws that are unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court beats Congress, Congress beats the president, but actually the president also gets to appoint justices. So it moves in both directions. And what the framers thought was that this set of never-ending institutional rivalries, where each branch of government could defeat another branch or be defeated by another branch, meant that we would forever control and break what they called the violence of factions. You could think of that as precursors to political parties. And when you add on top of that federalism, sort of the layered tensions and jealousies based on geography, we would really break down that dangerous factional violence. The problem is, although they had this vision, I sometimes call it the unicycle constitution because it kind of cycles forward or backward. Although they had this vision, they instituted a set of structures that fundamentally thwarted that vision by having directly chosen president processed through the Electoral College. We are divided into teams because each side recognizes that the winning strategy means fracturing the opposition but keeping your team united. And because that's mutual, we end up with two teams. And actually, if you go back even as early as George Washington's farewell address, which is pretty early in our history, you see that he lamented the growing partisanship. And it seemed to be the case even then that these rival games among the branches of government or at the level of federalism weren't working out as the framers intended. But this all became acute when our 18th century Constitution hit upon 21st century information age technologies for very particular reasons that we can talk about. So we were able to tolerate this for a good long time. But we do have to recognize that we tolerated it for a good long time. It's not as if it was necessarily the best way to do business as a democracy. And in fact, if you think about it, the United States has exported democracy for a very long time, but never successfully our form of democracy. And there's a very good reason for that. So there's a tension built into our system between what the framers thought they were doing and what they actually did.
Right. So the election of 1800 was pretty volatile. Of course, there's no social media, but there was pamphleteering and newspapers were quite rampant. Literacy was quite high, and people got their information relatively rapidly. So by the social media, what's the problem? It's the speed with which it spreads, or the polarization of people?
So there's sort of two elements to it, and they're synergistic. They kind of bring out each other's worst qualities, right? So part of it's social media, and part of it is hyper-partisan gerrymandering, and they're both a kind of gerrymander. So let me just briefly talk about the former, and then connect it to social media. So as a result of hyper-partisan gerrymandering, district lines that are drawn in ways that actually enhance the voting strength of the state legislative party that's in power to give it more seats, for example, in state legislative assemblies, but also in Congress, we end up with a system in which members of the House of Representatives are choosing their electorate. They're choosing their voters, not the other way around. But also in the social media age, as a result of the algorithms that are designed to keep us wedded to the page and engaged with our feeds, news media are choosing their readers, not the other way around. We've gone well past the point at which there are common sources of information upon which we all rely, and we have very large numbers of voters, may correlate with age. Younger voters may be more susceptible to the influence of the structure of social media news feeds, although to be honest, I know plenty of older people that are too. And what happens is we have this dynamic feedback loop from media, from social media to voter to politician to social media that moves the modes or the centers of our two political parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, increasingly far apart. And that's not an impression. That's actually demonstrated by data. If you look at the Pew Research Center from the early 1990s until now, what you see is that at one point, you had these kind of distributions for each camp that overlapped fairly considerably. And over those decades in the information age, they've moved further and further apart. And so now it's no longer the case that we're willing to say things like, well, somebody on the other side has looked at the same data I have in good faith, and they've achieved a different resolution. They've drawn different implications from that data than I have. Let's have a conversation. Now it must be the case that people on the other side, whichever side you're on, they must either lack basic intelligence or somehow be evil. And this has created profound dysfunction, both societally in the way we interact with each other, which is deeply painful and problematic, but also the growing divergence between the political parties at every step has become increasingly problematic, leading to just a fundamental governmental dysfunction.
I think if I recall, you have some graphs in the book. I think they were in the PDF showing that divisive. Maybe you could find that while I'm talking for a second.
Let me try to find it. So you're talking about the Pew graphic. I'm
yeah,
happy to.
So, I mean, if I recall,
happy to try to pull that up. Actually, I managed to open to the page.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Okay.
There it is. Yeah. So that is actually from the Pew. That's not something that we created for the book or that I created for the book. That is from the Pew Research Center. Now it shows 1994 to 2017. But if you think about it, 2017, I'm going to put it down, but I think people have had a chance to see that. But if you think about it, 2017 is relatively early in the Trump era. There's very little question that those modes have, if anything, grown substantially further apart in the intervening years. You know, there was a time when the parties had such considerable overlap that if you go back to the 50s, it's quite striking. The American Political Science Association published a study of the political parties in the early 1950s, and the major criticism is just unimaginable by modern lights. They said the big difference, the big problem with our two-party system is the parties don't give meaningful choices to the electorate. But if you think about it, you go back to the 1952 election, both the Democrats and the Republicans courted the exact same candidate to head their ticket, Dwight David Eisenhower. And in the same period of time, 5 years later, this economist named Anthony Downs publishes a book called An Economic Theory of Democracy. And it popularizes an intuition that we all have about our politics that isn't correct, but it's just common, which is we can define our politics as liberal to conservative on one line and imagine that if all people care about is policy and if all the politicians care about is winning, they'll converge on the center. And that wasn't really entirely Downs's point, but it is a conception that we all have. It just isn't actually the way that our politics works, because our politics implicates more than one dimension, and for very particular reasons, we're seeing a growing divergence, not a convergence.
Yeah. Keeping along the lines of the civic lesson, so every state gets 2 senators so that no state dominates another state. But on the other hand, it's not fair that Little Rhode Island has the same representation as big old California, where I'm at. So then that's based on population in the House of Representatives. Okay, what's wrong with that system?
Well, so that's an interesting, it's very striking. If you look at Wyoming's the most extreme case, right? A Wyoming voter has 67 times the voting strength as compared with a California voter. If you actually compare the populations of those two countries, and you look at the fact that Wyoming gets 2 senators just like California. And in fact, what's particularly interesting is that the lowest population 21 states, their population combined equals California. So 21 states have 42 senators. California still gets 2, even though the populations are the same. I do not propose reapportioning the Senate, not because I oppose reapportioning the Senate. I would say the Senate is the single most anti-democratic body in any nation claiming to be a democracy in the world. But I also believe that it's not necessary to reapportion the Senate to solve the fundamental problem of the constitutional crisis that we're facing. The subtitle of my book, and I'll put it up again, is The Least Radical Means of Radically Repairing Our Broken Democracy. So what I'm trying to do is be surgical here. I'm trying to say we have a fundamental problem with the two-party system in which the two parties are moving increasingly far apart. One of those is moving toward nationalism in a deeply profound way. It's affecting the other party in ways that leave moderates in both parties feeling disenfranchised in an earlier period of elite control. Those who would have been Tea Party, and that's sort of the early precursor to MAGA, those who were strong progressives, they felt disenfranchised. And the problem is that we fail to give our voters genuinely meaningful choices by limiting their choices to two, and by requiring them every 4 years to choose the lesser of two evils. And what I refer to in the book as the third party dilemma is this idea that every 4 years, voters are told, you have to vote for the lesser of two evils, because if you don't, you run the risk of favoring the major party candidate that actually you find more disturbing as between the two. And that's going to be full force in election 2024, which inevitably seems like it's Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, despite the fact that at last poll that I saw, 63% of American voters wished neither one of them were running. And so we have this problem in which we don't give voters meaningful choices. And the question then becomes, how do we give voters meaningful choices? And in the book, based on surveying several democracies around the globe, England, France, Germany, Israel, Taiwan, Venezuela, and Brazil, but picking up lessons from other countries along the way, I demonstrate that there are better ways we can do democracy. And two of the critical elements are having proportional representation and having parliamentary selection of the head of government. But that's a first step, because there are deeply problematic parliamentary systems, just as there are deeply problematic presidential systems. So we have to be a little more granular in our thinking, and we have to look closely at how these different systems work. Because what I'm proposing is a particular form of parliamentary governance that achieves what I refer to as the Goldilocks principle, because it turns out that the fundamental threat to democratic governance is having either too few parties like us, like the UK, think of Brexit, or having too many parties. Think Italy, for example. Think Brazil, for example. Problems in Israel, for example. And what you want to do is achieve what political scientists recognize as a sweet spot of typically between 4 and 8 parties. Not too many, not too few, like Goldilocks. And there is a way to do it, and political scientists agree that there's a particular system that achieves this better than other systems. And I've demonstrated we could make that kind of a system our own. This is a system that would work particularly well in the United States. It would solve the crisis, and it can be enacted.
Okay, last civics lesson question on the Electoral College. What do we need that for? What's the justification? It sure seems unfair every time the Electoral College nominates gives us a president who didn't get the popular vote majority. It just seems unfair. What's the justification, and what would you do about it?
Well, so it picks up on the thread of your last question, and I'll just relate them. So you asked about the Senate. It's egregiously unfair that Wyoming gets 2 senators, California gets 2 senators. Of course, this was part of the compromise between large states and small states at the time of the framing of the Constitution, where the Senate was chosen by state. And in fact, originally, state general assemblies chose the senatorial delegation, or had the authority to. We now do it by popular election, thanks to the 17th Amendment. Although that was a trend line before the amendment, most states were already beginning to do it that way. The Electoral College is an extension of that compromise. And the idea is that every state gets a number of votes in the Electoral College equal to the sum of their Senate plus House delegations. So the House delegations are based on population. The Senate delegations are 2 per state. Add them up. And it's part of that compromise, the purpose of which is historically to give smaller states some additional influence and authority, but the consequence of which actually ends up being kind of the opposite, right? So if we go back to election 2000, you talked about the fact that we sometimes have what I call upside down elections in which the Electoral College outcome is the opposite of the outcome in the popular vote. It's happened 5 times in our history, 2 times fairly recently. 2000 between Al Gore and George W. Bush, where Al Gore got more of the popular vote. And because of what happened in Florida, George W. Bush wins the election. And of course, in 2016, between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, where Donald Trump wins the Electoral College despite Hillary Clinton getting 3 million more votes among the popular vote. So a lot of people think that's the problem. They think the problem with our democracy is the occasional upside down election, but it is a symptom of the problem. And even solving that won't solve our problem of the fundamental threat to our democracy, and it could actually exacerbate the problem. So there is one good thing we can say about the Electoral College. I analogize it to a concept that criminal lawyers would be familiar with called harmless error, right? So in criminal trials, not every mistake that occurs in the courtroom results in overturning a conviction that may result. Some results you would have gotten even if the mistake hadn't been made. So one thing the Electoral College does is it creates an electoral harmless error. So it turns out that in the 2000 election, there were 5 states in which there were alleged electoral improprieties. But the only state that mattered was Florida, and everybody knew it because whichever way Florida went, that 25 set of votes in the Electoral College was going to tip it either fully in the direction of Bush or fully in the direction of Gore. All the other states were harmless error. So if you think about it, if we actually do a national popular vote and there's an effort to do it without an amendment, there's actually a coalition of states that are trying to kind of end run the ordinary way you would think of accomplishing this through a pact of sorts. Suddenly, harmless error disappears. And if you imagine that we still have 2 parties because we're still directly electing the president, the same incentive that produces 2 parties remains, suddenly votes anywhere in the country that are problematic become fair game. It could actually make far worse the partisanship over efforts to suppress voting, efforts to challenge voting after the fact, efforts to call somebody up to find a few 100,000 votes here or there, because suddenly every vote equally matters. It actually could make our partisanship more severe, if that's imaginable, than the severity that we're facing now. Because although it's true that it would be great to fix our upside down elections, which my proposals will do, that wouldn't exist. Doing it that way doesn't end our 2-party system, and that's giving rise to a larger set of pathologies. The upside down election is just one quirk in our system, but it's not the fundamental problem in our system, which is 2-party presidentialism.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain gerrymandering to us again and what the problem with that is?
Yeah, so gerrymandering has a really interesting history going back to a Massachusetts governor whose name was Eldridge Gerry, so hard G. It actually should be gerrymandering, but whatever. So he drew up a district that looked like a salamander, and somebody created a portmanteau marrying Eldridge Gerry's last name, Gerry, and Mander. As I said, should be gerrymander, but gerrymander, and everyone around the world uses the term gerrymander. What it really means is drawing district lines in a manner that creates a kind of packing supermajorities of folks in the party you don't favor and a spreading of the wealth. So you've got smaller margins, but more seats in the party that you do. And that worked pretty well for Eldridge Gerry. What's changed is that we now observe an incredibly high-tech capacity to engage in gerrymandering in ways that profoundly affect representation in state and in state legislative bodies in the House of Representatives. The best telling of the story is by David Daley, former editor of Salon, who wrote a book called Rat Effed, unceremonious title, right? But it actually is a political science term of art. A dirty deed done dirt cheap, that's what it means. And what he shows is that after Obama's first election in 2008, Republican operatives figured out that they could, for pennies on the dollar, throw money at state General Assembly elections. If they could flip enough of those bodies from blue to red or purple to red, they could then entrench Republican control across more state legislative bodies and entrenched Republican control of those delegations to the House. And they thought that the consequence of that was going to be to entrench Republican control for about 20 years. They were a little bit ambitious in that regard, but not egregiously ambitious. And it's played in both directions. I mean, honestly, the Democrats blinked with respect to the strategy that is referred to as red map. That's the strategy that David Daley describes. But both sides play the game. And the Supreme Court, which for a long time, with Justice Kennedy being the decisive justice until he stepped down, had suggested there might be some hyper-partisan gerrymandering so extreme that the court will strike it down. But as soon as he stepped off the court at the very first opportunity in a case called Rucho, the court abandoned that and said they used a doctrine with a kind of technical sounding name. It is the political question doctrine. They said it is not justiciable, not something the courts should be deciding. And as a result, the Supreme Court has basically green-lighted the ability of state legislative bodies entirely to engage in hyper-partisan gerrymandering. And so as a consequence of that, members of the House of Representatives are choosing their constituents, not the other way around, in the sense that those districts aren't competitive. Now, that's slightly misstated. They're not competitive in the general election. They are competitive in the primary cycle. But the irony there is that being primaried or threatened to be primaried moves the two modes further apart, right? Because if you're primaried because you're a centrist Republican, you're going to be inclined to be closer to the base to avoid being primaried. If you're primaried because you're a centrist Democrat, you're going to try to move closer to the base or you'll give up your seat. And so the consequence has been that as a result of our districted elections in the House of Representatives, and as a result of this hyper-partisan gerrymandering, which is sort of synergistic with or strengthened by our media partisanship as well, we are seeing the parties move further and further apart, creating both our governmental and our social dysfunction.
When you say primarying, do you mean like when Trump denounces somebody who's no longer loyal to him as they're coming up for re-election, so they just don't vote them in the primary and they pick somebody else?
That's precisely what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
But just to be clear, it happens on both sides, right? I mean, one of the things that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the squad tried to do when they first got in, right? I mean, first of all, she unseated Joe Crowley, who was more of a centrist Democrat who had served 10 terms, but they were threatening to primary members of the Democratic Party who were insufficiently progressive by their lights. So it is in fact true that Republicans have historically been better at this, but it's not as if the Democrats are completely ungifted in that they haven't tried to do some of the same things with problematic consequences.
Okay, parliamentary America. What is a parliament, and how does that differ from what we have? And what do we have? A constitutional democracy, right, or constitutional republic?
Well, the framers spoke in terms of a republic, and really what they meant by republic was that we're not a direct democracy. We are so large, even back then, we were way smaller back then on a population basis, but we were spread over a pretty big landmass. The idea of having direct democracy as the means of doing democracy wouldn't work given the scope and scale. So what they were thinking was, if we expand the scope and have a greater group from whom to choose our representatives, we'll have greater talent from which to choose, and we'll have a more effective government. That was very much what Madison wrote in the Federalist. But the other part of it was that they set up a presidential system. And as I say, they didn't think they were creating a two-party presidential system. They thought they were actually creating a system that would avoid the violence of factions. They didn't think there would be parties in the sense that we think of them today. But they set up a system that made two parties inevitable and increasingly entrenched over time. Throughout our history, we've had two dominant parties. That doesn't mean we've never had third parties. And we've had transitional periods where we've gone from one two-party system to another two-party system. And when we've had that transition, we've had the appearance of more parties. But when the dust settles, we've always had two dominant parties as a consequence of the way we choose the president, and also the fact that our states are geographically defined, and our districts, at least since the early 1840s, were generally geographically defined. Earlier on, we did have some at-large voting in states. There's a complicated history. I talk about that in the book. But by and large, we are choosing our representatives through geographically defined locations, whether it's the House, whether it's the Senate, whether it's the president, which gives rise to a two-party system. Parliamentary systems sometimes will have some districted representation, and the version that I propose actually lets every member of the House and Senate remain an incumbent in the state or district that elected them. That's part of the enactability. I believe that this is enactable in large part because, unlike the vast majority of proposals, which are functionally unemployment acts for members of Congress who you need to get these things enacted, mine actually lets them all keep their jobs. And those are good jobs. They like them. But more typically in a parliamentary system, you've at least got you've got either a complete system of proportional representation or a partial system of proportional representation, and the head of the government is chosen not by the voters, but by a coalition that forms in the legislative body, typically the lower chamber. Some governments only have one lower. Some democracies have only one chamber. Israel's an example of that. Most large democracies have two chambers, just like we do. The House of Representatives is our lower chamber. The Senate's the upper chamber. Typically, the lower legislative chamber will form a majority coalition, and the head of that coalition ends up having their person run the government. What I'm proposing is a system that blends districted representation with party-based votes, so everybody would go in on election day every 4 years, set aside the off-presidential years. You wouldn't vote for president directly, but you'd cast two ballots in the House of Representatives. One would be just like you do now, right? You'd vote for the Democrat or the Republican, likely to be two parties because it's geographically defined. But then you're actually going to vote by party. Your second ballot is going to be by party. And so what you're signaling there is, I want the Democrat to run the coalition, or at least give them a shot at running the coalition, but I want it to move in a progressive direction. Or conversely, I want it to work with the mainstream Republicans. Or I want the Republicans to begin the negotiation process, but I don't want them to join with MAGA. I want them to join with centrist Democrats, right? You can see that this system in which you cast two ballots empowers voters by letting them express their sincerely held views on policy, on identity, on culture, and send a real meaningful signal about what they want the coalition to look like. And those parties, suddenly, third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties, they're no longer spoilers. They're no longer a threat, because the nice thing about coalition governance is, for those parties to be effective, they're going to negotiate. I'll join the government, but here's what I'm going to demand. You're going to have to go with this policy that my constituency cares about. You're going to have to give me the appointment to this cabinet position that my constituency cares about. You might even negotiate a seat on the Supreme Court, right? And so when you vote for a third party, those parties reward you, to the extent they do their job well, by giving you something in exchange for your support. And so they deliver something meaningful, and you as a voter are motivated to vote for third parties when those third parties capture what it is you truly value as a voter in terms of your ideology and your policy preferences. And it turns out, if we look at democratic systems that include proportional representation as at least a significant part of their governing structure in coalition governance, voters are happier. The governments are more responsive people turn out in higher numbers and they feel more connected. They wouldn't trade their system for ours.
Okay, pick one or two examples from your half dozen around the world where this is something like this is being done and how it works.
Yeah, so the best example is Germany. So Germany, of course, has a horribly tragic history that we're all familiar with, the Shoah, right, or the Holocaust, the Weimar Republic, and the rise of Nazi Germany. So the problem, politically, if we look at this from a structural standpoint, that Adolf Hitler exploited was a fragmented, hyper-partisan, sort of too many parties in the system. He was able to get a plurality, which means the most seats short of a majority, and he was able to roll over other smaller parties and eventually get acquiescence by the president, who wasn't really the head of the government, to allow him to take over and become what he tragically ultimately became. So Germany's coming at it from the opposite side of where we're coming at it. They had too many parties, too much fragmentation, and they had a fascist party taking control. We have two parties. And as I said before, the twin threat to democracy is too few parties or too many parties. You want the sweet spot. So they came up with a brilliant scheme for post-World War II Germany, and it's called mixed member proportionality. And a survey of political scientists recognized this as really the best way to do democracy, and it has been benignly adapted by quite a number of countries globally. But let's talk about Germany. So the way it works in Germany, the lower chamber is called the Bundestag. That's the equivalent of our House of Representatives. There's an upper chamber called the Bundesrat. That's the equivalent of the Senate. So what happens is you as a voter vote for a district representative. They call it a constituency seat. Same thing, right? Representing a geographical constituency. Same idea as a district seat. But you also vote for a party. So you cast two ballots in the Bundestag. Now, if a party captures a majority of Bundestag seats, which virtually never happens, it would run the government on its own. But as typically happens, one party gets more seats than others, but not enough to form the government. It's going to form a government with another party, or maybe more than one party, and form a coalition government. So that's an example that works pretty well. There are quirks in the German system that my proposal avoids. And it gets a little bit mathy. I don't think we need to get into the weeds too deeply. But part of the problem is that the German Supreme Court insisted on perfect party proportionality, the consequence of which is that the size of the Bundestag has been increased. So you have an inflated Bundestag to meet the mathematical problems of perfect party proportionality and a problem that we could talk about if it interests you called negative weighted voting, just an anomaly in voting. I've avoided those problems. Our House of Representatives in my proposal would be doubled from 435 to 870, but it would be stable at that size. We wouldn't have perfect party proportionality because our states are of different sizes and fractions don't always work out the same way. We only need good enough proportionality to break the two-party the two-party problem embedded in our democracy, to make sure that no single party will typically capture a majority of seats, so that we move from this hyper-partisan two-party system to multi-party governance. So the German system is a nice example. They're dealing with another problem, and they've just modified their system. But we always have to understand that each country faces its own problems. But this system could be benignly adapted here because we could simply add another cohort of representatives based on those party ballots. With each state's delegation, we take the party votes and use them to make sure that we get good enough proportionality, and we will end up with a multi-party house that is going to create a coalition government. The way I've structured it, up to 5 parties can negotiate forming a majority coalition until a majority coalition forms. And I've got a backstop there too. So we end up with stability, unlike a lot of parliamentary systems where you can have election after election after election and you don't end up with a coalition. My system recognizes the importance of the United States being able to predictably know it has a government. We are the biggest superpower in the world. We have to be able to commit ourselves. So I keep presidential terms. I keep the 4-year choice of president, the 2-term limit. It really is the least radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy. I'm not upending unnecessarily our constitutional system. I'm adapting a system that has been regarded widely by political scientists as the best, and I'm looking to make parliamentary America, emphasis on America, right? So that it really is a system that would work for us.
So just to be clear, you'd keep the 100 senators.
Yes, indeed, I would. And I talk about that. So there's a couple of points to make there. I would love the Senate to be apportioned. I would love, alternatively, to have the Senate play a less significant policymaking role as occurs in many countries throughout the world, where the lower chamber is the principal driver of policy. The upper chamber is more limited to things like appointments and advice and consent and these sorts of things. However, the Constitution has an impediment to taking that on, and that is that the amending clause in the Constitution actually says the one thing you can't amend is apportionment in the Senate. Now, that doesn't really mean that. What it means is that you need 2 amendments to apportion the Senate. You have to amend the amending clause to make it so you can amend the Senate. So you need 2 amendments, right? Okay. My point is that as the United States becomes a multi-party system, what we'll see is, of course, 2 parties will dominate in these geographical races, but it doesn't mean we'll see the same 2 parties in every region of the country. And there's actually precedent for that even in the US, the Farmers Party in Minnesota and some other states, right? So what we may end up seeing in the Senate actually is a gradual emergence toward a multi-party system, because although individual states will have 2 dominant parties, they won't have the same 2 parties in every state. So it may be the case that over time the Senate becomes a multi-party system. And I believe that once we become a more functional government, which I'm convinced the system will create, we can have conversations about other improvements to our system that might be more fair, right? But I don't want to take on things that aren't essential to fixing the problem we have. That's the least radical part, right? I have a wish list of other things I'd like to do. I talk about it in the book. Here are some other things I'd love to see reform. But the goal of the book is to get us to the point where we are a profoundly functional democracy. And then there are other things we can talk about doing, but we have to be surgical. We have to be willing to say the goal here isn't to punish members of Congress who we are disappointed in. It's actually to bring them along. Let them be the heroes of democracy. Let them be the folks who actually created a transformation in our democracy to a truly thriving multi-party democracy. I'll give them all the credit in the world. I don't care who gets credit for this. I just want to create a thriving democracy so that my children and future generations get to live in a United States that would like for them. I'll add this. The dedication of my book is really short. Nice. To my children and yours. And I mean it.
Right, right. Okay, what's the magic number? 4 parties, 5? Is there too many?
4 to 8.
6 or 7 would be too much?
4 to 8. 6 to 7 is the sweet. 6 to 7 is the sweet spot.
Okay, just to use current examples, maybe we'd have MAGA, and then the old GOP, people like Mitt Romney. And then on the left, you have the Hillary, Bernie kind of centrist, just to the left, old school liberals. Then you got the progressives, the squad, and so on. Then maybe you have the RFKJs, and maybe the libertarians. Maybe there's 5 or 6 in there.
Beautiful. You got it exactly as I would have said it. I might have pushed Bernie over with the progressives. That's the only disagreement I might have had with you, because I do think that he's kind of the grandfather of the progressives. But other than that, I'm with you. In other words, I think we naturally have roughly 5 to 6 parties. We could quibble about whether there's a crossover party, whether RFK really has a movement. I'm not sure that he does, right? There might be a Green Party. There might be space for that. It might even attract some conventional conservatives. We can quibble about the 6th party. It doesn't matter. But I think we naturally agree that the Republican Party today is a blend of traditional GOP plus MAGA, or America First. The Democratic Party is kind of an unhappy marriage between center, sort of centrist Democrats and progressives. There might be space for a libertarian or a Green Party. So in our system, what we're missing is a mechanism by which to allow those parties to break down that way and to actually flourish. And I think that the big mistake that reformers are making is imagining we can just admonish people to support third parties. It is our institutional structures that inhibit the creation of third parties. Because going back to this very simplistic notion of a single political line, the one thing we can say is each side knows it has to fracture the opposition and stay united. And that gives rise to two parties. And those two parties, throughout our history, have done everything they could to make it difficult for third parties to emerge and thrive. And the only way you can have meaningful third parties is through structural reform. And we have to be willing to confront that reality. We can't tinker at the edges. We can't say, oh, let's have somebody run. We can't have the forward party. We can't have sloganeering like forward, not right, not left. That doesn't create a third party. The problem is embedded in the structures of our Constitution. We have to change our institutions to achieve meaningful third parties. We can do it, but we can't do it by pretending that there's an easier Band-Aid that solves the problem.
Okay, so the forward party, Andrew Yang, ranked choice voting, you would see this as just a Band-Aid that's not going to really fix the problem?
In some respects, worse than a Band-Aid for ranked choice voting. If you think about ranked choice voting or multi-member districts, those are unemployment acts for members of Congress. You are literally asking members of Congress to support a proposal, the very purpose of which, upon implementation, is to replace them with centrists. And it's a little bit hard to imagine. Now, of course, we could have a convention called by states. It's never happened before, but it could happen. And I argue that if we actually do have a convention called by states, my proposal becomes even more attractive because it becomes the pressure release valve that lets Congress say, okay, you're proposing all these things, but we've got a set of fixes that we think fix the problem. We've got credibility because all amendments have come from Congress before, which is true, right? They've all come from Congress. They've never come from a convention of states, and they will fix the problem, right? So I really believe that this is an enactable set of proposals, whereas things like term limits, ranked choice voting, multi-member districts, all of which are designed to make it easier to elect people who will replace the incumbents. It's pretty hard to get the incumbents behind that campaign.
Right. How do you incentivize people to go along with your program? Okay, let's just think about this out loud. Senators won't mind because they still get their 2 per state. Would congressmen feel like my vote has now been watered down 50% because there's now twice as many of me representing my state, and therefore I don't want to do this?
Well, so you will have more senators. You have two means of representation, but you're gaining the ability to choose the president. And you're allowing people who are in the House to head up additional parties. You don't have to go along with Donald Trump if you're a conservative to actually gain power, right? You're not forced into a sort of a two-party system where you're limited to just two teams to choose from. So you're giving more power, and also members of state general assemblies. Suddenly you've got list systems where people who are in state general assemblies have a pathway to get from the state capitol to Capitol Hill without necessarily having to play the typical every 2-year fundraising game. They're going to be able to demonstrate an ability to put together coalition governments. They're going to be able to demonstrate a skill set that will benefit the state. And people who are good at district retail politics, have at it, right? You get to keep your district. And so I think that these proposals, number one, they are empowering, not disempowering, of the most significant political actors who matter, both at the state and at the federal level. Number two, it gives space for them to have more choices in terms of how they want to run their professional careers. They're not limited to only two pathways, Democratic or Republican. And number three, it makes it so that it's no longer the case that everybody is constantly casting aspersions on the other side. Think about the different campaign in this system. Today's campaign is a campaign of denigration, right? You're always castigating or insulting the other side. Imagine a campaign that looks like this. I want your vote. I know some of you might be more progressive than me. Some of you might embrace more conservative policies than me, but this is who I am. And I can work with people who don't think exactly the way I do. I can work with people who don't think exactly the way you do. I can put together a team. You're not going to agree with everything, but I think you're going to agree with the values that we share. We're committed to good governance. We're committed to delivering. Just imagine a campaign like that.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine now. Yeah,
but that's the way you would have to campaign.
Yeah.
In order to form a successful coalition.
So
it's not a fantasy.
The Mitt Romneys and the Liz Cheneys would not just be denounced by the MAGAs. They'd just go off and form their own party, and the MAGA people would have to deal with them. And on the
absolutely,
left,
and more power to them. And they may end up forming a grand coalition with the centrist Democrats, from whom the progressives spin off to form their own party. And frankly, great. That's not a permanent coalition, but it could be a wonderful transitional coalition.
Yeah. In Germany, what's the party? AfD? Is that the one?
AfD,
that's the kind of party? Yeah. But with their system set up the way they are, could they never pull off a Hitler-like takeover?
So look, you never want to say never. You never want to say it's impossible. But what you do want to say, or what you want to achieve, is making it more difficult. You want to make it as difficult as it can be. So although it is true that the AfD is a party with some influence, it has remained a minority party. The real threat of an AfD is, in a two-party system, the problem is you can't afford to give up any of your members. So you have to acquiesce to AfD, or you have to acquiesce to MAGA, even if you wouldn't have ever thought you'd agree with the points that are being raised by extremist members of your party. I don't mean to equate MAGA with AfD. I'm only using it for analytical purposes. I'm not saying everybody, I'm really not saying that. But my point is that in a two-party system, the risk is an extremist faction can take over the party and then win the general election. In a system with too many parties, that party could gain a plurality and then begin rolling over other parties. In a system with that sweet spot of 4 to 8 parties, you make it structurally more difficult for that party to do it because other parties have competition. They can form coalitions with others. They are not limited to you. And so the premise of all of this is institutions matter. We have to make our institutions serve our people. Right now, they don't. There's no institution that's going to be an absolute foolproof guarantee against problematic results. But that doesn't mean we should give up the fight for better institutions that minimize the likelihood of the worst results. Right now, we don't have that, but we can. We can achieve a set of better institutions that dramatically reduce the likelihood of the most problematic results. I have an interesting background. I spent the first part of my career at George Mason Law School. Second part of my career at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. Two very different places, right? I know a lot of conservatives, know a lot of liberals, know a lot of progressives, know centrist Republicans, right? So yeah, we all, I mean, I like to think we all have friends who don't agree with us, don't necessarily embrace our personal political views. That's the way it should be. The problem is it's becoming increasingly difficult as a result of the hyper-fractionalization and the hyper-partisanship in our society.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my Republican friends they don't like Trump, feel like, well, you have to vote for him. And same thing on the left. Most of my liberal friends my age, they don't like the far left progressive movement, but, it's like, but I have to vote Democrat. That's my team. So much of it is just...
There's only two choices.
Yeah, there's only two choices. Yeah, my wife's from Germany, so she's always telling me about the coalitions and Angela Merkel has to do this and that because she doesn't have a majority. Anyway, so yeah, I really like this model a lot. How do you get started? Short of everybody in Congress reads your book and goes, "Hey, this is a great idea. Let's do this." How do you start?
So honestly, this conversation and others that I'm doing, right? I mean, I'll literally be traveling around the country a bit. I've got a planned trip to LA. I've got one that's coming up in Seattle. I'll be giving talks
Nice.
here on the East Coast, and hopefully many more to be scheduled. Some virtual like this, some live. So the first step is to get people to think differently. And really, the principal reason I wrote this book was I believe very much in the proposals. I think this is achievable. But I think the first step is we have to get people to reframe their understanding of how our system works. We have to get past this notion of American exceptionalism, right? That's the first step. People have to recognize that we may have thrived for a quarter of a millennium, not because of our unique constitutional design, but in spite of it. And there are very clear reasons why we might have survived in spite of it. We've been geographically isolated from foreign military threats. We've had a constant influx of highly motivated immigrants. We had the capacity for westward expansion, albeit at tremendous pain and cost to Native Americans. And we had the original sin of the tragedy of bringing enslaved persons to the before the United States and maintaining them here in a state of abject terror. It may be that those are the reasons we survived, not because of what a group of people who met in Philadelphia a quarter of a millennium ago came up with. It might be in spite of some of the things they came up with. And I don't mean to suggest that everything that they did was necessarily mistaken, but they did make mistakes. And we have to be open, as you said, to the idea that these were people. They're not gods. And they didn't have a lot of the perspective we have today. We know more about the business of democracy today. We have other models we can look at. And so part of it is education. And yeah, part of that education over time will include government officials, members of Congress. I think it's vitally important that they be included in the conversation because there is this visceral tendency on both sides to want to claim that the framers had it right, the framers were brilliant, the framers made no mistakes. We have to get past American exceptionalism. We have to be willing to learn from the experience of others. We have to be willing to imagine, as is true, there are better ways to do democracy. So in terms of how to get this done, look, I'm going to be giving talks. I think this is the most important thing I've done in my career, and I've been in this career for a pretty long time, right? I've been teaching since 1992. I'm 63 years old. I am happy to do this for as long as I'm able to be doing what I do for a living. And I will. And I really mean it. I will talk to people. I will talk to them regardless of their political beliefs. I think everybody can gain from this in the sense that they can finally say, I'm going to actually vote for somebody who cares about me and whose values I share.
Right. Why is it that, and maybe I just don't know enough history about this, but it seems to me like in the old days, the convention is where it's all decided. These, behind closed doors with the cigar smoking guys, and we're going to decide who our candidate is. And they on the left, they go, okay, Joe, thank you for your service. You got us through the last 4 years, but it's time for you to retire. We got our new guy, and that's what we're going to go with. I don't think that can happen. Why? Or on the other side, the same thing.
Well, it's funny. There was an op-ed. Oh my God, it might have been Ross who thought, but I'm not sure. In the New York Times, sort of predicting what you just said, saying that Biden's going to stay in until the convention, and then in the convention he's going to make plans that he's stepping aside, and then he's going to have the smoke-filled rooms, right? I'm married to an oncologist, so I have to get rid of the cigar metaphor. But figuratively speaking, right, the smoke-filled rooms choose a successor. And it's an interesting idea. The problem I have with it is that it plays into all of the tropes about elitism. I mean, imagine Trump against whoever the Dems pick in that scenario, right? I mean, all of the people who buy into this notion that there are elites pulling the strings of our democracy, that plays right into it. You're right. Historically, it was much more of a deliberative process. That's what the framers had in mind, and it got superseded by the entrenchment of the two-party system. It's part of the tension between what the framers thought they were doing and what they actually did that we, sort of now, I mean, really, what's the Electoral College? It's like an algorithm.
Right.
No one's attending. No one's paying tuition. It's an algorithm. We the night of the election, we see what the results of the Electoral College are. It's just a formula. That's all it is, right? And it's a stupid formula. It's a formula that nobody, at the front end thinking, how would I construct a system? Here's a way to do it. Literally, I don't think anybody on the planet would say this is the way to do democracy. But that's all it is. It's just an algorithm, and it happens to have the one benign feature of limiting contested elections to the only places they matter. So we get to cabin challenges as compared to what would have if we replaced it with a national popular vote. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, we have kind of morphed into a system that just further deeply entrenches the two-party scheme that really has its foundations in the structure, as opposed to the writings of the Federalist Papers, the structure of the Constitution itself.
Yeah. Well, as a voter and a concerned citizen, I like your system in the sense that I would like to. I'm not going to vote for RFKJ, for example. He's an extreme conspiracist and a lot of anti-science stuff on his vaccines and
absolutely
pharmacy. But there are some things he says that are, the militarism and the, endless dollars poured into the military and the regulatory capture by pharmaceutical companies of the regulatory state. We got to keep on top of that. Yeah. So I wish I had some of him and some of his people in there just a little bit, to kind of make that point. And then, whoever on the left and whoever else on the right, maybe the libertarians are in there and the Green Party. I'm concerned about the environment. Yeah, let them have a voice.
We all have to be.
Yeah,
we all have to be. Right? How can we not be concerned about the environment? We look at the models from 10, 15 years ago, and it turns out that they were understating the threat that we're experiencing globally.
But if you have a Green Party, it's like, well, that I don't want the Green Party to be completely in charge. I mean, that's not, I have other concerns too. So yeah, 5 or 6 parties would be great. Yeah. All right, Max, I hope you do it.
Well, thank you, Michael.
You
it
have
was
my
a pleasure.
support. You have my vote.
Well, I greatly appreciate that. And it's, I'm in this for the long run. It really has been a pleasure to talk to you.
Good. All right.